The city is a churning sea of concrete and glass, a place where the air stays thick with the scent of exhaust and the sound of horns that never seem to rest. Amidst this relentless machinery of modern life, there is Elias. He walks through the chaos not as a victim of its frantic speed, but as a master of his own internal tempo. While others glance nervously at their watches, their brows furrowed with the anxieties of deadlines and social status, Elias carries a presence that suggests he is anchored to something far more permanent than the shifting trends of the urban landscape. His reputation precedes him in the boardrooms and the local parks alike. To his neighbors, he is the man who always has a kind word and a steady hand. To his colleagues, he is the unwavering strategist who remains cool when projects falter and stocks tumble. On the surface, Elias's life looks like a masterpiece of balance, virtue. He has spent decades cultivating a career that balances ambition with ethics, and a family life that feels like a warm hearth in a cold world. He is often compared to a great oak, standing alone in a vast clearing. Its crown is wide, offering shade to the weary and a sense of permanence to the landscape. People see the thick bark and the sprawling limbs, marveling at how a single entity can withstand the biting winds of winter and the scorching heat of summer without ever bowing. They admire the result, but they rarely consider the process. They see the strength of the wood, but they forget the labor of the roots. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias knows that the oak's secret is not its height, but its depth. Every day, while the world watches the branches, the tree is busy pushing its life veins deeper into the earth, searching for the cool, hidden waters that sustain it when the rains fail. The first sign of the coming tempest does not arrive with a thunderclap, but with the subtle vibration of a phone on a heavy mahogany desk. It is a call from his senior partner, a man Elias has trusted for 20 years. The words spoken are few, but they carry the force of a wrecking ball hitting a glass house. Allegations, financial discrepancies, and a calculated move to strip Elias of his legacy. The narrative of his life's work is being rewritten in real time by the pens of those he once called brothers. In that moment, the room feels like it is spinning. The walls of his office, lined with awards and photographs of his smiling family, seem to press inward, threatening to crush the peace he has worked so hard to maintain. Elias closes his eyes and takes a slow, steady breath. He doesn't reach for a lawyer first. He reaches for his foundation. He reflects on the spiritual geography of a human life, asking himself a question that has guided his every step since youth. Where is he truly planted? He realizes that most people plant themselves in the shallow topsoil of their achievements, their bank accounts, or their popularity. When the weather is fair, they flourish and boast of their vitality. But when the ground shakes and the winds howl, they are the first to fall because they have no grip on anything eternal. He looks out the window as the first heavy clouds roll in from the horizon, swallowing the midday sun in a shroud of gray. The city, usually so vibrant and full of movement, takes on a ghostly, monochromatic hue as the shadows lengthen. The wind begins to whistle through the skyscrapers, a low, mournful sound that signals the end of an era. Elias feels a strange, terrifying clarity amidst the rising tide of fear. He knows that his exterior world is about to be stripped bare to the bone. The leaves will be torn away, and the heavy branches may snap, but he is anchored in a truth that the storm cannot reach. He is planted in Christ, and that soil is unshakable, deep. Just then, a flash of lightning illuminates the dark sky. The first rain falls. The sky did not just darken, it bruised, turning a sickly shade of purple and charcoal as the wind began to howl through the concrete canyons of the city. Elias sat in the heavy silence of his office, the dial tone of the previous call still echoing in his ears like a funeral bell. It wasn't just a financial hit, it was a surgical strike against his very soul. The betrayal had a jagged double edge that cut through years of shared history. His business partner, a man he had mentored with the patience of a father, and his closest friend, the one who had held his children at their baptisms, had woven a web of deceit so intricate it seemed impossible to untangle. They hadn't just stolen the capital of the firm, they had attempted to steal his name and his honor. As the first reports of the scandal began to ripple through the digital news cycles, Elias watched the world he knew begin to disintegrate in real time. In the cubicles outside his glass door, the atmosphere shifted from professional rhythm to frantic, low-frequency terror. He saw men and women who had defined their entire identities by their titles and their bonuses suddenly looked like ghosts haunting their own lives. They were the ones with shallow roots, planted in the decorative mulch of corporate success and social standing. When the sun was out and the markets were high, they looked vibrant and strong. But now, under the lash of this unexpected storm, they were being uprooted by the dozens. Their foundations were built on the shifting sands of human approval and material wealth, and as the legal tides rose, their internal structures were collapsing into the foam of panic and despair. Elias felt the weight of the loss pressing against his ribs, a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief that threatened to steal his breath. He thought of the decades of long nights, the integrity he had maintained when it would have been easier to cut corners, and the legacy he hoped to leave for the next generation. It felt as though a forest fire was roaring through his life's work, turning green dreams into grey ash in a matter of minutes. Yet, amidst the rising smoke of his career, there was a strange, cold peace that resided in the center of his being. It was a peace that defied logic, a peace that shouldn't exist when a man is watching his house burn down. His mind drifted back, far away from the polished mahogany and the glowing digital screens, to a small, drafty room during the lean years of his youth. He remembered himself as a young man, full of ambition, but plagued by a terrifying realization that the world offered no true guarantees. He had stood on a pier during a literal summer gale, watching the boats that were tied only to the wooden dock toss and turn. Some snapped their lines and were dashed against the rocks. Others, anchored deep in the harbor's hidden floor, stayed steady despite the height of the waves. It was in that moment of youthful clarity that Elias made his choice. He decided he would not anchor himself to the pier of public opinion or the shore of financial security. He would anchor his life in Christ, the only bedrock that the storms of time could not erode or shift. He had spent his nights not just studying market trends, but studying the Word, letting the promises of God sink into his heart like water into dry, parched soil. He had intentionally grown downward as he grew upward. Now, that ancient decision was being tested in the crucible of the present. The betrayal stung like salt in a fresh wound, and the whispers of a darker path began to hiss in his ear. A tempter's voice suggested he should fight fire with fire, using his knowledge of his partner's own secrets to destroy them before they could finish him off. But Elias knew that to use the world's weapons was to move his roots from the living water into the bitter salt of vengeance. He stayed his hand, even as the storm outside intensified, the rain turning into a horizontal wall of water that blurred the city's skyline. He stood up, grabbing his coat, his movements deliberate and calm. He needed to get home to the sanctuary of his family. But as he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed with a notification that chilled his blood. It was a security alert from his home system, followed by a blurred image of a black car idling at his front gate. The betrayal had moved beyond the boardroom. His family's safety was no longer a certainty. The storm had breached his final defense. The rain was no longer falling, It was attacking, a relentless barrage of liquid iron that turned the city's streets into churning black rivers. Elias navigated his car through the blinding spray, his knuckles white against the leather of the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the dim tail lights of the world disappearing ahead of him. In his pocket sat a small silver USB drive, a cold, heavy weight that represented the quick fix. It contained the decrypted records of his business partner's offshore tax evasions and a history of illicit deals that would not only clear Elias's name, but would effectively incinerate the lives of those who had betrayed him. The temptation hummed like a low-voltage wire against his thigh. It was the world's way, a strike for a strike, a calculated move to salvage his crumbling empire by destroying the destroyers. To use it would be a dishonest shortcut, a betrayal of his own integrity to save his skin. Yet it felt like the only way to keep his family from falling into the abyss of poverty and shame. As he fought the steering wheel against the hydroplaning tires, Elias felt the spiritual drought of the world pressing in on him. He realized that modern life is a desert disguised as an oasis, where people drink from the salty water of ambition and wonder why they are still thirsty. He thought of his spiritual nutrition, the way he had spent decades watering his soul when the sun was shining and the ground was soft. He had always known that you cannot grow deep roots during a storm. You can only rely on the ones you grew during the peace. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, breathing in the scent of damp upholstery and fear, and reached into the soil of scripture he had hidden in his heart. The ancient promise of the 46th Psalm rose within him like a bulwark. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. These words were not mere platitudes. They were the structural steel of his identity. He had spent his mornings in quiet prayer, soaking in the presence of the divine, building a reservoir of peace that the world could not drain. He reached his neighborhood where the streetlights were flickering and dying under the weight of the gale. As his headlights cut through the gloom of his driveway, they reflected off the wet metal of a black car idling near his gate. A figure stepped out, hunched against the downpour, a man who had once been like a brother to him. It was his former partner, the architect of this ruin, looking small and fragile in the face of the elements. Elias stepped out of his car, the wind immediately soaking him to the bone, the cold biting through his coat. The confrontation was not what the world would expect. There was no screaming, no physical violence, only a profound and heavy silence. The partner began to shout over the wind, his voice high and frantic, trying to justify the theft and the lies as necessary business. He looked at Elias with eyes full of a wild, cornered terror, expecting a lawsuit or a punch. Instead, Elias stood before him with a grace that felt entirely alien to the moment. He felt the human anger swirling in his chest, a dark tide of resentment, but it was met by a divine peace that surpassed all understanding. He looked at the man who had tried to uproot his life and felt nothing but a heartbreaking pity. "I have what I need to destroy you," Elias said, his voice calm and steady beneath the roar of the sky. "But I will not let your darkness become my own." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver drive, and watched as the light caught its metallic surface. In a single deliberate motion, he dropped the quick fix into a storm drain, watching the current sweep the weapon away into the darkness. It was an act of radical surrender, a refusal to use the world's poisoned tools to build a kingdom of sand. The partner stared at the drain, then at Elias, his face contorting with a mixture of confusion and a deep, soul-level shame. He couldn't understand a man who would rather lose his house than lose his soul. Without a word, the betrayer climbed back into his car and sped away, his tires throwing up a spray of grey slush. Elias was left alone as the storm reached its terrifying peak. The wind shifted to a hurricane-force howl, a sound like a freight train passing through his backyard. A massive oak tree at the edge of his property, one he had admired for its height, suddenly groaned and snapped, its shallow roots failing as it crashed into the side of his home. The sanctuary was breached, the glass shattered, the roof groaned, and the lights of the city finally went out. Elias stood at the center of the ruins, his clothes plastered to his skin, his sanctuary falling apart around him, yet his feet remained firmly planted in the unseen ground. The hurricane had arrived, and everything he owned was being swept away, leaving only the man and the foundation he had chosen long ago. The wood screamed first, a high-pitched splintering agony that cut through the baritone roar of the hurricane. Then came the impact, a shuddering, bone-deep thud that vibrated through the floorboards and into the very soles of Elias's feet. The great oak, once a symbol of majesty on his front lawn and a silent guardian of his property, had become an instrument of destruction. As the roof of his sanctuary buckled under the weight of the fallen giant, the ceiling above the living room surrendered with a violent groan. Plaster rained down like grey, choking snow, followed immediately by a torrent of freezing water that smelled of mud and ancient disturbed moss. In a matter of seconds, the place where he had prayed, laughed, and watched his children grow was transformed into a jagged, open-air cavern of debris. Elias stood amidst the ruins of his life's work, his lungs burning with the sudden intake of cold, damp air, his clothes instantly heavy with the weight of the sky. The wind howled through the new gap in his world, mocking the very idea of shelter. In that moment of total physical vulnerability, the internal struggle began to claw at his heart with more ferocity than the wind. He had lived his life by the book, had anchored his soul in the promises of a loving creator. Yet the reality of the freezing rains soaking his skin felt like a harsh, physical contradiction. He looked at the shattered remains of his family's dining table, the wood split as clean as a broken promise, and felt a surge of raw, human agony. A thought whispered in the back of his mind, dark and persistent, echoing the doubts of 1,000 years. If God is for me, why is the wind so cold? It was the ancient cry of the afflicted, the question that has echoed through every valley of shadow since the beginning of time. Elias realized that the spiritual life is not a magic shield against the elements, but a fire that is meant to burn within them. The wind was cold because the world was broken, but his foundation remained because it was never built on the drywall and timber now littering the floor. It was never about the house. It was about the eternal anchor that held him steady even when the walls vanished. Through the gaping hole where his front door used to be, Elias saw a flashlight beam cutting through the horizontal rain. A figure stumbled into the wreckage. Julian, a man Elias had once mentored, now a cynical shell of a professional who had long ago traded his ethics for a faster ladder to the top. Julian looked around the ruined living room, his face a mask of bitter, twisted satisfaction. "Look at this, Elias," Julian shouted over the gale, his voice dripping with a poisonous kind of sympathy. "All that integrity, all that rooted in Christ talk, and look where it got you. You're standing in a graveyard of your own making." He stepped closer, holding out a mud-streaked folder he had pulled from the inner pocket of his heavy coat. "The partners are already filing their legal reports. They're pinning the entire corporate collapse on you. But I have the signatures they forged, Elias. I have the evidence. We can bury them. Sign the affidavit I've prepared. Tell the lie the investigators need to hear so we can crush them. It's the easy way out. It's your only way to get back what you lost. It's justice, or at least the closest thing you'll get tonight." The temptation was a physical weight, heavier than the fallen oak. Julian was offering a path of revenge disguised as restitution, a way to turn the pain into a weapon. For a heartbeat, Elias felt the allure of the eye for an eye philosophy. It would be so simple to let the anger take the wheel, to let the bitterness provide the warmth that the storm had stolen from his bones. But as he looked into Julian's hollow eyes, he saw the ultimate cost of that choice. To seek revenge was to move his roots from the living soil into a bed of hot, suffocating coals. "No," Elias said, the word barely a whisper, yet carrying more weight than the wind itself. He looked at Julian, seeing not an enemy, but a man who was already drowned in his own resentment. "I will not build a new life on the bones of my character. My foundation is not this house, and it is certainly not the destruction of others. If I lose everything and keep my soul, I have lost nothing. But if I gain the world by becoming like you, I have lost everything." Julian scoffed, a jagged sound that was swallowed by the storm and vanished back into the darkness. Elias was left alone in the freezing rain, picking through the wreckage with numb fingers. As he moved a heavy piece of the collapsed roof, he saw a glimmer of movement. Nestled in a small, dry pocket formed by two fallen beams was a neighbor's small dog, shivering and terrified, but alive. And beside it, clutched in the debris, was a hand-painted wooden cross his daughter had made years ago. It was a fragile thing, yet it had survived the weight of the oak. In that small, unexpected source of hope, Elias felt a warmth that no winter wind could ever extinguish. The house was gone, but the life within was merely beginning its most important chapter. The rain tapered off into a melancholic drizzle that whispered over the ruins like a soft, mournful breath. Elias stood in the skeleton of what used to be his living room, the small dog tucked into the crook of his arm, its heartbeat a frantic drum against his chest. His house was now a graveyard of memories and shattered debris, but as the dawn bled a bruised grey over the horizon, the heavy silence was finally broken. It wasn't the sound of more destruction, but a sharp, rhythmic cry of distress echoing from the houses further down the street. Elias didn't hesitate. He placed the shivering dog safely in a dry corner formed by the collapsed roof and stepped over the threshold that no longer held a door. His neighborhood, once a pristine grid of manicured lawns, looked like a jagged landscape from a forgotten war. He saw Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow 3 houses down, standing on the edge of her porch, staring blankly at the street with hollow, terrified eyes. Elias didn't think about his ruined career, the legal papers Julian had brandished, or his own pending financial collapse. He simply moved. He walked through the thick, cold mud and wrapped his own damp coat around her shaking shoulders. "I'm here, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice raspy from the night, but steady as a stone pillar. "We're going to get through this together, one step at a time." A divine irony defined the hours that followed. Elias had lost his sanctuary. His reputation was being systematically shredded by his former partners, and his physical security had evaporated. Yet, as he moved from house to house, clearing heavy debris from trapped doorways and offering words of quiet strength, he felt a peculiar, overflowing fullness. Those who had anchored their lives in their property and status were drowning in despair, their internal foundations having been washed away along with their topsoil. But Elias found that when you have nothing left but Christ, you realize the presence is the only thing you ever truly needed to survive. His hands were blistered and his back ached. But the spiritual nutrition he had cultivated during the prayerful years was now sustaining not just himself, but a dozen others who had nothing left to hold on to. He looked at his hands, covered in grime and angry cuts from the splintered ancient oak. These were the scars of the storm, the physical marks of a night spent in the mouth of the lion. Yet they did not feel like symbols of defeat. To Elias, they felt like the rough, protective bark of a tree that had survived a century of harsh winters. A resilient heart, he realized, is not one that avoids the breaking. It is one that allows the cracks to be filled with a light that does not belong to this world. His life before the storm had been a season of hidden growth, a time of pushing roots deep into the silent earth of faith. Now, in the light of a devastated morning, those roots were finally proving their worth. The surface life was gone, stripped away by the gale, to reveal the rugged character of a man who knew his worth was never tied to a bank account. Mid-morning, while emergency sirens began to pierce the heavy air, Elias found a brief moment of stillness near the ruins of his shattered study. He sat on a pile of sodden books and closed his eyes. He breathed in the scent of wet earth and ozone. The thunder was a distant memory now, replaced by the still, small voice that always speaks loudest in the vacuum of total loss. In that prayer, he didn't ask for a refund of his old life. He simply listened. He felt an inexplicable peace settle over him like a warm shroud. The storm had not come to destroy the man. It had come to destroy the illusions he might have still been clinging to. It was a refining fire clearing the way for something more authentic and eternal. As he stood to continue his work, his foot caught on a jagged piece of metal, a corner of his old filing cabinet tossed across the lawn. It was jammed shut, its frame twisted by the weight of the fallen oak. But a single, fragile piece of paper was snagged in the metal gap, fluttering like a white flag of hope. He pulled it free, expecting a mundane bill. Instead, his eyes widened as he recognized the handwritten ink of an old mentor. The words revealed a long-buried secret, a contact for a man who held the keys to his legal vindication. The betrayal was not the final word of his story. The storm had unearthed the evidence that would restore his life. Elias clutched the paper, the ink slightly blurred by the damp air, but the message as clear as a bell in a silent room. It led him to a retired auditor named Silas, a man who had once been the conscience of the firm before being pushed into a quiet, forced retirement. With Silas's testimony and the damp, crumpled documents Elias had pulled from his ruined filing cabinet, the truth began to emerge from the deep shadows. The legal resolution was not a long, drawn-out war, but a sudden, blinding revelation. In the sterile, high-ceilinged rooms of the city's courthouse, the intricate web of deceit spun by his former business partner and his supposed friend began to unravel thread by thread. The evidence was undeniable, exposing a pattern of fraud that Elias had been blind to in his season of prosperity. The climax of the legal battle arrived on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of ozone and fresh beginnings. Elias sat across from Julian and the others who had orchestrated his downfall. He watched as the arrogance drained from their faces, replaced by the pale, sickly hue of men who realized their hollow foundations could no longer support the weight of their massive lies. When the judge's gavel finally fell, vindicating Elias and restoring the reputation they had tried so hard to tarnish, there was no cheering in the room. There was only the heavy, expectant silence of a world waiting for a reaction. The court had returned his status, his funds, and his name, but it could not return the peace he had already found in the ruins. Julian waited for the blow, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a physical strike. He expected a lawsuit that would strip him of his own home, or at least a verbal lashing that would burn. But Elias did not shout. He did not gloat. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and filled with a grace that seemed foreign to the cold, legal environment. He walked toward the man who had betrayed him, stopping only when he could see the frantic pulse in Julian's neck. "I forgive you," Elias said, his voice a steady, low rumble that carried the weight of a life lived in the truth. He didn't just mean he wouldn't sue for damages. He meant he was releasing the debt from his own heart. "You tried to uproot me, Julian, but you only succeeded in showing me how deep my roots actually go. I hope one day you find soil that can hold you too." As Elias stepped out of the courthouse and back into the streets of the city, The last of the storm clouds finally surrendered. The sun broke through in a violent, beautiful explosion of light, hitting the wet pavement and turning the puddles into mirrors of liquid gold. He drove back to his neighborhood, back to the great oak that still stood sentry over his ruined property. The tree was scarred, its branches thinner than they had been a week ago, but it was undeniably alive, its core untouched by the gale. The community had gathered near the wreckage, not to gawk at the destruction, but to find the man who had become their unexpected anchor during the darkest night of their lives. Proof of his resilience was written in the way people looked at him. While the city rushed to patch its roofs and clear its drains, the people in Elias's circle were looking for something more permanent. They were drawn to the root that had held him upright when every other pillar of his life had crumbled. They saw that while his house was gone and his career had been attacked, his character remained entirely intact, polished rather than diminished by the friction of the crisis. He had become a living testimony to the fact that a man is not defined by what he owns, but by what he refuses to give up when the wind screams. The emotional impact on the neighborhood was profound. Elias then faced a final test as his old firm offered him his position back. He looked at the wreckage and then at the community. A new, deeper calling was now pulling at his soul, demanding a choice between two worlds. Elias stood at the edge of his property, the letter from the corporate board still clutched in his hand. It was a golden ticket back to the life of prestige, a return to the air-conditioned silence of the executive suite where the only storms were those recorded on a digital stock ticker. But as he looked at the raw, open earth where the hurricane had torn through his garden, he felt a strange, solid refusal rising in his soul. He realized that the man who had survived the tempest was not the same man who had once walked those sterile, carpeted hallways. He didn't belong in a glass tower anymore. He belonged here, in the mud and the grit, helping others find the same bedrock that had saved his heart. He slowly folded the offer and set it aside on a stack of reclaimed lumber. He chose instead to pick up a heavy, steel-headed hammer, a tool of restoration rather than one of manipulation. The rebuilding process was not merely a matter of following blueprints. Every nail Elias drove into the new cedar frame of his house felt like a physical prayer of gratitude. He wasn't just building a shelter for his family, he was constructing a living monument to a life anchored in Christ. Neighbors who had once seen him as a distant, successful professional now saw a man whose hands were calloused and whose heart was wide open. The community began to gather in his half-finished living room, sitting on overturned crates and piles of drywall. They didn't come for coffee or small talk. They came for something far more substantial. They came with heavy questions about how he had stayed so calm when the world turned upside down, and why he didn't seek vengeance against Julian when he had every legal right to do so. Elias took this responsibility as his new primary vocation, understanding that his survival was meant to be a lighthouse for others. He began to mentor the next generation, the young men and women who looked at the wreckage of their city with a paralyzing fear in their eyes. He took them to the base of the great oak, which was showing tiny buds of new growth on its scarred limbs. He taught them that the true strength of a tree is never measured by the impressive spread of its branches or the greenness of its leaves, but by the invisible tenacity of its roots. He showed them that if they planted their lives in the shifting sands of social status or the approval of a fickle world, the first strong wind would sweep them into the sea of despair. But if they anchored themselves in the eternal truths of the gospel, they would become immovable. He spoke to them with a voice that carried the authority of experience, talking about the spiritual roots that require seasons of silence and darkness to grow deep. He explained that the storm, as terrifying and destructive as it was, had actually been a necessary grace. Without the wind, the tree would never have known where its secret weaknesses lay. The gale had stripped away the dead wood and the parasitic vines that had been draining his spiritual energy for years without him even noticing. In the aftermath of the crisis, he was leaner, stronger, and more focused on what truly mattered. The catastrophe had not been an interruption of his life. It had been the revelation of his true character. He wanted the youth to understand that they shouldn't pray for a life without storms, but rather for a root system that could withstand any weather. As the months passed, the neighborhood began to transform in a way that architecture alone could not explain. It wasn't just that the houses were being repaired, the very spirit of the people was being reinforced from the inside out. One by one, others began to adopt Elias's philosophy, seeking out a foundation that wasn't made of stone and mortar. On a clear, crisp evening, Elias stood on his newly finished porch and looked out across the urban horizon. He saw his family laughing together in the kitchen, their bonds forged in the fire of shared loss and restored hope. Beyond them, he saw the silhouettes of dozens of other families who were now standing taller, their lives beginning to mirror the resilience he had modeled during his darkest hour. The imagery was breathtaking, a literal forest of resilient trees standing together against the darkening sky, their branches reaching upward in a collective gesture of endurance. They were no longer isolated individuals trying to survive a hostile world. They were a grove, their roots intertwining beneath the surface to provide hidden support for one another. Elias realized that his legacy wouldn't be found in a bank account or a corporate title, but in the hearts of those who had learned to trust the anchor that holds firm when the cables snap. The great oak was no longer a solitary metaphor. It was a living reality for an entire community of believers. To those watching his journey from afar, Elias offered a final, quiet reflection. The storms of life are an absolute certainty, and the winds of trial will eventually come for everyone. The question is never if the clouds will gather, but where your life is planted when the first drop falls. He invited every soul to look beneath the surface of their own busy existence. Do not wait for the hurricane to test your foundation before you decide what you believe. Start planting your roots today. Dig deep into the Word of God, anchor your heart in the unchanging love of Christ, and let your soul find the living water that never runs dry. The sun will always rise again, and when it does, may it find you standing firm, unshakable and full of hope, ready to face the horizon with a peace that the world can neither give nor take away. The time to grow deep is now, before the wind begins to howl once more.